long before the sound of muskets, before war drums echoed off limestone walls, before flags were raised or fell or burned, there was only the land, wide, endless, wild, a land that did not yet know the word Texas. Only the rustle of grass in the wind, and the slow turning of the sun over canyon and scrub. This place was not empty. It was never empty. It breathed through the earth and sang through its people. For thousands of years, it was walked by nations with no borders, only stories. The Tonkawa, the Coahuiltecan, the Karankawa who lived along the salt-rimmed coast, and the Comanche and Apache who rode like wind across the plains. These were people whose histories were passed not in books, but in firelight, in the shape of painted hands on canyon walls, in the way one deer trail curved to the river and another vanished into stone. The Comanche were riders of the southern plains, hunters, warriors, horsemen. Their empire was not carved in stone, but written in fear. They did not build forts. They did not build missions. But their presence stretched from horizon to horizon, their horses slicing silence into wind. To the south and east, the Apache moved like water. Sometimes enemy, sometimes ghosts, living in the space between Spanish maps and Spanish reach. They would become both the hunted and the hunters, as new people arrived bearing iron, fire, and unfamiliar faith. And then, from the east, came sound. Not war drums, not yet, but bells, soft at first, hung from ships carved from another world, bells calling not to battle but to mass. The Spanish came not only with soldiers, but with priests, friars, and the memory of Rome. They did not simply conquer. They believed they were transforming, souls to be saved, land to be claimed, people to be civilized. They brought iron nails and wooden crosses, and where they found villages, they built missions. Not fortresses, but something quieter, stone by stone, cane by cane. Missions rose across the land like prayers. Here, in the southern heart of the future Texas, they built 5. 5 missions across the San Antonio River, linked not by roads, but by rivers and faith. These were not just churches. They were gardens, workshops, villages. The walls held not only worship, but weaving and farming, pottery and cooking, to hopes and fear. And always soldiers, because even mercy came with muskets. And the missions, for all their devotion, still carved space where others already lived. And not all would kneel. To protect the friars, Spain built presidios, small fortresses, and stationed troops across the north of New Spain. This was not a stable land. It was not meant to be. It was a frontier. One such mission, built in the early 1700s, bore a name that would echo through time. Mission San Antonio de Padua. It was not grand. It was not meant to be. But the soil was rich, the river close, and the path between Mexico and Louisiana crossed its door. Around it, a town began to form, a fragile, dusty patch of civilization in a wilderness that had never asked for one. The town became San Antonio, and the mission? In time, it would come to be known by another name, not one of saints or scriptures, but of cottonwood trees, Alamo. The name means cottonwood in Spanish. The name likely came from the soldiers, specifically the company of San Luis Potosi who stationed there. They named their outpost El Alamo del Parras, the cottonwood of the vineyards. The trees grew thick near the river, tall and silver green, their leaves trembling with every breeze. They gave shade, they gave wood, they whispered in the Texas wind. And over time, the name passed from the trees to the walls beside them. Alamo, a soft word, a whisper, not yet the roar it would one day become. In the 18th century, San Antonio was still more mission than city. Horses outnumbered people. Church bells outnumbered clocks. The days moved slowly, and the nights were filled with stars. Native converts and Spanish settlers lived side by side, though rarely as equals. The friars taught Latin, taught faith, taught obedience. The soldiers kept watch. The farmers grew maize and beans. Children ran barefoot through dust and sun. But beneath the stillness, cracks. As the mission aged, it began to erode, not just in stone, but in purpose. The indigenous populations, decimated by disease and disillusionment, began to drift away. Some fled, some died, some stayed, but only in body. By the late 1700s, the missions were weakening. The Spanish crown lost interest in its distant outposts. The world was shifting, empires were stretching thin, and the mission known as Alamo, it was no longer purely a church. The friars left. The army moved in. It became a barracks, a garrison, a shell repurposed for war. But even then, even as walls crumbled and rifles stacked, the land around it remained quiet. There was still a kind of peace, a brittle, uneasy, temporary peace. No one knew what this place would become. Not the soldiers, not the farmers, not the children who played in the shade of the cottonwoods. The land was not yet legend. It had no prophecy, only people and time and the slow weight of history. But something was stirring beyond the borders. New nations were rising. New dreams, clothed in different flags, were making their way west. The silence would not last. But for a moment, just a moment, there was only the sun and the river and the soft rustle of leaves. Before the cannons or before the walls, there was only silence and the whisper of a name, Alamo.
The air was changing, not with wind, but with something heavier, something that drifted over mountains and deserts, like smoke from a distant fire. Far to the south, in the old colonial cities of New Spain, the drums of revolution had begun to beat. They were soft at first, a priest ringing a bell in the countryside, a village gathering in defiance. But over time, the sound grew louder, heavier, until the very foundations of empire began to tremble. Spain was losing its grip, not all at once, not with one battle or one treaty, but slowly, painfully, like a crumbling wall, piece by piece, brick by brick. The empire it had built across oceans and over centuries was beginning to fracture under the weight of its own silence. In 1810, the first sparks lit the dry brush. Rebels marched, kings faltered, and by the time the war had burned itself across a decade, Spain was exhausted, its colonies restless, its treasury empty, and its once proud dominion in the Americas slipping into memory. In 1821, Mexico became a nation, not polished, not united, but free. It was not born in a palace, but in the dust of rebellion, formed in contradictions, torn between old faith and new freedom, it said, between monarchists and republicans, between what it had been told to be and what it hoped to become. And with that birth, everything changed, especially in the north. To the far north of Mexico's new borders, there was a place called Texas. It was not a city, not even a province of note. It was a wild, sunburnt edge of the known world, a borderland where maps faded into myth, where buffalo still roamed and Spanish was only half heard. Few Mexicans lived there. The missions had faded. The presidios had thinned. And the native tribes Comanche, Apache, Tonkawa still moved through the land with no regard for flags or frontiers. The Mexican government looked north and saw a void, a wilderness, an opportunity, or a problem, depending on the day. They needed settlers, people to work the land, defend it, anchor it in the new republic. So they opened the gates. From across the Sabine River, the Americans came, not in armies, but in wagons, men with weathered hands and hungry eyes, women carrying children and iron pans, sons with rifles, fathers with dreams. They were not conquerors, not yet. They came with land grants in their pockets and promises in their hearts. Mexico had offered them land rich, vast, and cheap. All they had to do was settle it, farm it, defend it, swear loyalty to Mexico, speak Spanish, and embrace Catholicism. On paper, it was simple. On paper, they agreed, but paper tears, and promises dissolve in the rain. Stephen F. Austin led the way, the father of Texas, though he was still just a son of the frontier. Quiet, patient, methodical, he brought the first 300 families, who became known as the Old 300. They carved homesteads from the wilderness, built cabins and dug wells, planted corn, branded cattle, hung American flags on Mexican land. More followed. Dozens, hundreds, thousands. Soon the Anglo settlers in Texas began to outnumber the Tejanos, the native-born Mexicans who had lived in the region for generations. And though the land was Mexico's, the language was English. The schools taught American history. The churches leaned Protestant. And the culture? It looked more like Tennessee than Tampico. The differences were small at first, subtle, like a cracked pot holding water. You don't notice the leak until the ground is wet. Language was one crack. Most settlers didn't speak Spanish and had no desire to learn. Religion was another. Though they agreed to convert, few ever did in truth. Mexican officials frowned, but their reach was long and their grasp was loose. Then came the question that couldn't be ignored. Slavery. Mexico had outlawed it, but many settlers brought slaves anyway. They called them indentured servants, gave them papers that said one thing while their chains said another. Tensions simmered. Edicts were passed, but enforcement was weak, and many settlers saw no reason to obey laws from a government they viewed as distant, foreign, and fading. Over time, Mexico tried to reassert control. Taxes, tariffs, military outposts, immigration limits. But the settlers pushed back quietly at first, then louder. They petitioned, they protested, they hinted at rebellion in the margins of their letters. To them, this wasn't Mexico. This was Texas, and Texas was different, more free, more wild, more theirs. And in Mexico City, the government watched with growing unease. Then came the final turn. In the 1830s, power in Mexico shifted again. Santa Anna rose not just a general, but a storm wrapped in flesh. He cast aside the liberal constitution of 1824 and replaced it with a centralist regime, tighter, harsher, absolute. He disbanded local governments, raised armies, crushed state rebellions. And when Texas began to whisper of independence, Santa Anna did not hear whispers. He heard treason. The drift toward unrest became a sprint toward revolt. But in the early days, it didn't look like revolution. It looked like a gathering. Like neighbors meeting under an oak tree to share news. Like colonists writing letters across the plains, wondering who still remembered the old Constitution. Wondering who still believed in the promises made on paper. Some wanted independence. Some wanted reform. Some just wanted to be left alone. But the seed was planted. And it was growing in every dusty field, in every log cabin, in every firelit discussion that ended with silence and staring at the floor. It was in the wind, in the rivers, in the slow widening space between what was Mexico and what might be Texas. And so the land changed again, not with conquest, not yet, but with questions. Questions whispered in two languages, over campfires and in council halls. Who are we? What are we owed? Where does our loyalty lie? And how long can we live between two worlds, neither fully Mexican and nor fully American? The answers were still far away. But the soil had been turned. The roots were growing, and something restless was beginning to bloom in the wilderness. Not yet a war, but close. Not yet blood. But soon. This wasn't rebellion, not in name. Not yet, but it was close enough to hear the hoofbeats. The stone still remembers, not just the fire and the gunpowder, but the prayers. The chants that once echoed in candlelight, long before muskets flared and men fell against its walls. Before it was a ruin, before it was a symbol, the Alamo was a mission, a place of faith, of labor, of discipline, a place caught between two worlds, the sacred and the surviving. It began not as a fortress, but as a vision, a dream carried north by Spanish friars. Men in brown robes guided by ritual and empire. They did not come with armies. They came with crosses, with sacred texts, with the belief that they could remake the world, one soul at a time. In the early 1700s, the Spanish crown sought to anchor its hold on the distant frontier of New Spain. Texas was wild, vast, unruly, and thinly held, so they built missions, not just to preach, but to plant roots. Among them rose Mission San Antonio de Padua, eventually called Mission San Antonio de Valero, though it would later be known simply and forever as the Alamo. It sat along the banks of the San Antonio River, in a space where spring-fed waters curved gently around scrubland and stone. It was not grand, but it was deliberate. The mission was laid out like a heartbeat, a chapel at the center, flanked by barracks, workshops, fields, and corrals. Everything had a rhythm, every moment a purpose. The days began in silence. Then the bells rang, not to summon soldiers, but to summon souls. Life inside the mission followed a sacred clock. Time was broken into prayer, into labor, into obedience. The friars lived simply. Their cells were bare, their robes rough against the skin, but their purpose was clear: to convert the native people, to fold them into the rhythm of the Catholic world. The native peoples, Coahuiltecan and others, were brought into the mission walls. Some came willingly, seeking shelter from drought or enemies. Others came by pressure, by persuasion, or by desperation. Their lives changed completely. They were given new names, new clothing, new routines. From sunrise to sundown, they worked the mission fields, tended livestock, cooked meals, learned Spanish, and were instructed in the faith. There were baptisms, weddings, funerals, and always instruction, religious education that sought to reshape not just belief, but identity. They lived under strict rules. The mission was not a sanctuary. It was a system. Disobedience brought punishment. Escape brought pursuit. And yet, it was also a kind of home. A place of safety for some, a prison for others. The chapel stood at the heart of it all. Simple stone walls, high ceilings, a place where candles flickered against carved altars, and prayers rose like smoke into silence. The friars believed they were saving souls. The converts believed many things. Some believed the new path was better, some followed out of fear, and some never believed at all. The mission grew. At its height, it housed hundreds, dozens of families, working, worshipping, enduring. But nothing on the frontier lasts forever. By the late 1700s, the mission system across Texas was weakening. Disease had ravaged the native population. Isolation had drained the friars' strength, and the Spanish crown was shifting its focus elsewhere. As the mission's numbers dwindled, its purpose became blurry. Some missions were secularized, their lands divided, their churches abandoned. San Antonio de Valero began to fade, not in walls but in spirit. The friars left. The fields fell fallow. The bells rang less often. And in their absence came soldiers. Around the turn of the 19th century, the mission was slowly converted into a military post. Its thick stone walls, once meant to protect from raiders and storms, now housed troops. The transformation wasn't immediate. It crept in like ivy. The chapel became a storeroom. The cells became barracks. The sacred square became a parade ground. And the silence of prayer gave way to the clink of iron, the bark of orders, and the stomp of boots. The Mexican army, still under Spanish rule at first, then under the new Mexican Republic, used the site as a garrison. It was renamed the Alamo, not for its history, but for the company stationed there, a group of soldiers from Alamo de Parras, a town in northern Mexico. They brought the name with them, and the name stayed. But even as a garrison, the Alamo was imperfect. It had not been built for defense. Its walls were strong, but its layout awkward. It had no moat, no bastions, no long-range cannon platforms. Yet it was used because it stood, and because on the frontier anything that stands becomes useful. For years, the post drifted between decay and renewal. Roofs collapsed and were patched. Doors were replaced. Walls were reinforced with whatever could be found. It was never truly fortified, just repurposed. In time, Texian settlers would also use it. During the early rebellion, it passed from hand to hand, garrisoned by one side, then another, filled with muskets, powder, wounded men, restless ones. It had been stripped of its sacredness, but not of its weight, because even when half broken, even when crumbling under sun and neglect, the Alamo still stood, still bore witness. By the early 1830s, as revolution stirred the air, the old mission began to fill with new purpose again, not the purpose of saving souls, but the purpose of holding ground. The Texians, marching toward open rebellion, knew its walls could offer a last stand, a final line, a symbol. And yet, inside the dust of its corners, the whispers remained, of friars, of prayers, of native children learning hymns they would later forget or reject, of labor and loss, of hope. It was never just a battlefield. Not truly. It was built to shape lives, not end them. To build, not destroy. And so when it finally became what we know it as today, a place of sacrifice, of legend, of violent memory, it did so not by design, but by forgetting what it once was. The Alamo before the Alamo was never meant for war. It was carved for something softer, something slower, something that could not survive the fire that was coming. But the walls still stood. And when the storm came, they bore it all. Not as a mission, not as a sanctuary, but as something else entirely. Something the friars never imagined. A place where prayers once rose, and where silence would soon fall again. But in a different voice. Not the voice of hope, but the echo of loss. While Texas slumbered, Santa Anna marched toward a dream of empire. The deserts of the south shimmered with heat. In the valleys, bells still rang for morning mass. And in the capital, the ink of revolution had barely dried. Mexico was free. But freedom came with ghosts. The empire was gone. The Spanish had sailed away. But what remained was a nation barely born, carved from rebellion, crowned with contradictions, and already wobbling beneath its own ambition. Mexico was a dream in fragments, bound by rivers, languages, and centuries of layered rule. Indigenous nations still claimed the land. Old Spaniards still held power. And in between rose the voices of a people, trying to stitch something new from the remnants of the old. A republic. An idea carried in parchments and promises, but fragile, so fragile. And into this fragile new world walked a man who would wear many faces and carry many flags. His name was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, but he did not arrive as a storm. At first he came like a breeze, charming, flexible, confident, a military officer with charisma, more mask than man. He had fought the Spanish, he had played the patriot, and the people, still unsure of the country they'd inherited, looked to strong men for certainty. Santa Anna understood this. He did not need to take power. He let it drift into his hands like a feather falling from a high place. He waited, he smiled, and when he struck, it was not with steel, but with silence. He called himself many things: protector, president, savior. But what he truly craved was something older than words: control. And so, while Texas baked under quiet skies, Santa Anna reimagined Mexico, not as a republic of voices, but as a crown resting firmly on his own head. The republic had once had a guide, the Constitution of 1824. It was a liberal document, not perfect, not easy, but it had given shape to hope, federalism, state autonomy, representation across distance. It had tried to hold a sprawling country together, without force. But that kind of government is slow, messy, and vulnerable to those who do not like waiting. Santa Anna waited just long enough, then stripped it all away. He abolished the Constitution, dissolved the legislative voices, and replaced them with one voice, his. The republic did not fall overnight. It bent, stretched, cracked at the seams. And state by state the protests began. It wasn't just Texas, not yet. All across Mexico, resistance began to stir. Zacatecas rose. Yucatan rumbled. Coahuila and Nuevo León muttered discontent. These were not foreigners. These were Mexicans, demanding the rights promised to them, fighting not against their country, but for it. But Santa Anna saw no distinction. Rebellion was rebellion, and rebellion could not be tolerated. He moved like a storm now, swift, brutal, wrapped in glory and iron. He crushed Zacatecas, marched through cities as a liberator and left them in ashes, raised armies with one hand, and erased opposition with the other. He wore the uniform of the Republic, but ruled like a king. Meanwhile, in the north, Texas watched and learned. The settlers had grumbled before. Now they saw something new. A government that no longer resembled what they had signed up for. A leader who ruled from the center, and a constitution torn from history like a page in the wind. They had petitioned. They had waited. They had hoped Mexico would hold true to its early promise. But promises like borders shift with power, and Santa Anna's Mexico no longer looked like the nation they had pledged loyalty to. The distance between the Mexican capital and Texas was more than miles. It was time, culture, memory. The settlers in Texas were used to independence. They ran their own towns. They guarded their own fields. They carried with them ideas from older rebellions, from American soil, from whispers of liberty. Now they watched the general in Mexico City strip state after state of its freedom. And they wondered, when will he come for us? Santa Anna didn't see a collection of unique provinces. He saw a map, a shape to be kept whole, a name to be feared. And if a piece resisted, then it was broken, and it would be replaced. Texas was not yet a revolution, but it was becoming a question, a challenge to be answered. And Santa Anna believed he had the answer. The stage was nearly set. But even now, before the guns, before the sieges, before the cry of independence echoed over scrub and sand, even now, you could feel it in the wind. A kind of tightening. The breath before a storm breaks. A land that had changed hands many times was about to become a battlefield again. In towns across Texas, meetings grew more tense. Councilmen spoke in hushed voices. Militias trained quietly behind barns. The air was ripe with unease. This was no longer a dispute over taxes or language. It was something deeper, existential. A people who had lived in the quiet gap between two nations now found themselves being forced to choose, to submit, or to resist, to bend, or to break. And Santa Anna, he was not waiting. He was building armies, sharpening purpose, and casting his shadow long across the land. To him, Texas was not special, not sacred, just another state out of line, another ember to be crushed underfoot. But Texas was not like the others. Its people were not just Mexican, nor just American. They were something in between. Rootless, restless, resolved. And when the time came, they would not kneel. But that moment hadn't come yet. Not fully. For now the roads were still passable, the letters still written, the hope still dimly alive that something diplomacy, distance, time might cool the heat rising from the south. But hope is fragile, and Santa Anna was already marching. His armies would soon cross deserts. Wagons would creak under the weight of artillery. Trumpets would announce his arrival, and the land would burn again. While Texas slumbered, the storm gathered strength, not of wind, but of will. A dream of empire was taking shape in the heart of a man who called himself a servant of the people, but acted as the master of them all. And far to the north, in a dusty mission, whose stone walls had seen many faces, the future waited in silence. Not yet legend, not yet war, but close. So very close. The river whispered quietly as the sun rose over the prairies. Cattle stirred. Boots crunched over dirt roads. And in the town of Gonzales, someone looked south and said, "They're coming." It wasn't a full army. Not yet. Just a few Mexican soldiers I sent on a mission that seemed small enough. Retrieve a cannon, one small cannon, barely more than a noisemaker, left behind years earlier to defend the town from raiders. Old, rusting, but a weapon nonetheless. And in Santa Ana's Mexico, weapons in rebellious hands were a risk. So the order came. Go, take it back. But something had changed in Texas, and when the soldiers reached the riverbank outside Gonzales, they found no welcome, no surrender, only a message. Not yet war, but a warning. The people of Gonzales weren't soldiers. They were farmers, traders, mothers, sons. But they had heard the stories of Zacatecas, of crushed dissent, of promises broken from the capital far away. And so when Mexican officers politely asked for the cannon back, the town did something unexpected. They said no. They stalled. Sent messengers? Delayed. Then quietly called for help. Riders went out in all directions. To neighboring towns. To ranches. To anyone who might fight. And slowly, steadily, they came. They weren't an army. Not really. Just a ragged line of men with muskets and knives, slouch hats and bad tempers, drawn together by something older than strategy, a sense that the time had come. Texians, they called themselves. Anglos, Tejanos, outcasts and dreamers, bound not by flags but by a common anger. They were tired of waiting. Tired of watching a distant government twist into something unrecognizable. Tired of being told to kneel. They didn't know what they were building, only what they were resisting. So they crossed the river, took position near the old cannon, and watched soldiers. The standoff had begun. It was barely a fight. A few shots. Some shouted orders, and then retreat. The Mexican detachment fell back, unprepared for resistance, unwilling to start a full battle so far from reinforcements. But for Texas, it didn't matter how brief it was. It was something more than a victory. It was a beginning. The story of Gonzales spread like fire in dry grass, across rivers, over hills, through the post roads and stage stops of the South. One cannon, a homemade flag, a town that stood its ground. It wasn't just news. It was myth in the making. Men who'd been unsure now packed their bags. Old fighters from the War of 1812 dusted off their rifles. Young dreamers from Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, they saddled their horses and headed west. They weren't Texans. Not yet. But they believed in the story that had started to form. That somewhere in this forgotten corner of Mexico, a people had said enough. The cannon they had defended was barely useful. Too small to make a difference in any real war. But symbols don't care about scale. It wasn't about the cannon. It was about the choice. To say no. To hold the line. To refuse an empire's demand. That refusal echoed through every campfire and tavern, in words passed from mouth to mouth and often changed, often embellished, but always with the same heart. A flag had been raised, not just of resistance, but of defiance. In the weeks that followed, volunteers kept arriving. Some carried muskets, others brought supplies. Some came alone, hoping to join something bigger. Others came in groups, companies, militias, whole families. Many didn't fully know what they were fighting for. Land, liberty, adventure? It didn't matter. What mattered was that something was happening, and they wanted to be part of it. Gonzales had lit the match. Now the fire needed tending. The myth of independence began not in a grand hall, but in muddy fields and handwritten notes. There was no organized army, no formal government, no unified vision, only a growing sense that the past was ending and the future could be made by force if necessary. Gonzales became the rallying cry, a name whispered like a prayer or a challenge, a place where regular people had drawn a line and dared the world to cross it. The people of Texas had not declared independence. Not yet. But the air had shifted. You could smell it in the camps, hear it in the speeches, feel it in the silence between sentences. They were no longer just settlers. They were soldiers now. Some came for glory, some for vengeance, others perhaps for escape. But once they arrived, they were part of something larger. They cleaned their weapons, practiced formation in open fields, built makeshift forts from timber and stone, and waited, because if Gonzales had been a spark, then surely the fire would spread. Santa Anna would not ignore this. He couldn't, and everyone knew it. The cannon had not just fired a shot, it had shattered the illusion of peace. In San Antonio de Bejar, Mexican troops watched the countryside grow restless. Whispers reached them of rebels massing, of towns refusing orders, of letters sent to the U.S. begging for aid. The government in Mexico City still spoke of order. But in Texas, order was unraveling. And in that unraveling, a strange kind of clarity formed. The people no longer asked for things to go back to how they were. They began to imagine something new, something separate. Gonzales was no longer just a skirmish. It was a signal, a line drawn not just across the prairie, but across time. Before Gonzales, loyalty, uncertainty, fear. After Gonzales, resistance, courage, direction. The flag that flew that day was homemade, crude, stitched by hands that didn't know they were making history. But history doesn't wait for perfection. It only asks for conviction. And in that flag, white canvas, black letters, a star, a cannon, a dare, they had found their voice. Come and take it, not shouted, but whispered like a promise. So they trained, and they waited. And they built something strange and unplanned, a rebellion without a blueprint, a cause still finding its name. But it had begun. The river still flowed, the grass still swayed in the wind. But now every sunrise brought more strangers to the cause. Every campfire lit at night meant another soul had crossed into the unknown. No one knew what would happen next, but Gonzales had made one thing clear. Texas would not go quietly.
The winter wind was sharp, but the fires kept burning. Across the open plains they came, some in wagons and some on horseback, some with nothing but a pack and a borrowed musket. They came with half-full canteens and big ideas. Some came barefoot, some came drunk. But they all came for the same reason, San Antonio, or more precisely, San Antonio de Bejar. A dusty outpost of stone buildings and narrow streets, where General Martin Perfecto de Cos had made his stand. A garrison of Mexican soldiers holed up in the old city, while the Texian rebellion gathered in the distance like a coming storm. No one quite knew how to take a city, but they were about to find out. At first, it was a waiting game. The Texians and Tejanos, too, camped outside the city. They set up rough shelters, under trees and along riverbanks. They sang songs, drank whiskey, argued over tactics they barely understood. A siege, they called it, but it looked more like a tailgate with rifles. They had no proper uniforms and no real chain of command. Their cannons were borrowed or broken. Their food supplies were unpredictable. Discipline came and went like the wind, but they had numbers and fire in their bellies. And more than anything, they had time. Inside the city, Cos held firm. His troops manned the walls. They patrolled the plaza. They fortified the Alamo compound as a fallback. They waited, hoping the rebellion would lose steam or scatter back into the countryside. But outside, the siege only grew. The rebels didn't leave. They multiplied. And behind every poorly dug trench and every whispered campfire plan was one thought pulsing louder each day. This is our chance. The days dragged. Cold mornings, restless nights. Occasional skirmishes broke out. A few shots here, a charge there. But for weeks, nothing decisive. Some wanted to attack right away. Others said wait. Wait for better weather. Wait for more guns. Wait for God to intervene, maybe. But winter doesn't wait, and revolutions don't stall politely. So finally, they moved. The siege became a battle, not in open fields, not with cavalry charges and flag-waving heroes. This was house to house, window to window, street by street. The Texians advanced through narrow alleys, ducking behind adobe walls. They used ladders to scale rooftops. They knocked holes in buildings and fired through the plaster. Every house was a fortress, every doorway a trap. Mexican soldiers fired from courtyards. Snipers peered from bell towers. Gunpowder smoke curled through the streets like fog. The air grew thick with noise and confusion. It wasn't glorious. It was gritty, slow, exhausting. But it was working. Among the rebels were Tejano fighters, Spanish-speaking residents of Texas, who had lived under Mexican rule their whole lives. They knew the streets, they knew the houses, and more importantly, they knew that this wasn't just a gringo rebellion. It was their fight, too. They guided the troops, kicked open doors, pointed out blind corners. They were the maps when paper maps failed. In the dust and the smoke, it didn't matter where you were born, only where you stood. As the battle raged, Cos pulled his men back. Street by street, they lost ground. By mid-December, he had only the Alamo compound left. But the rebels were tired too, their ranks thinned by wounds and desertion, their clothes in tatters, their boots full of holes. They were running low on everything except determination. It came to a head in silence. Cos looked around, at his injured, at his trapped men, at the walls that would not hold, and he surrendered. Just like that, the siege ended. There were no parades, no trumpet fanfare, just a stunned quiet. They had done it, somehow. A city had fallen, an army had left, and the flag that flew over San Antonio now belonged to the rebels. They captured a town, captured supplies, captured belief. And belief is the deadliest weapon of all. After the surrender, the Texians moved into the city like ants over sugar. Some took up guard duty. Others collapsed into makeshift bunks. Some predictably found the local whiskey stash. A few tried to act like soldiers. Most just breathed. It was the first time in months they had felt still. There were debates, of course. What next? Do we hold the city? Do we push deeper into Mexico? Do we go home? But for now, they did something strange. They relaxed. San Antonio became a sort of accidental capital. Meetings were held. Plans were drafted. Militias reorganized themselves into something resembling companies. Leaders emerged, not always by merit, but by noise. There was talk of freedom, of independence, of forming a government. It was heady stuff, dreams spoken aloud by people who had never had power. The illusions settled like morning fog. Maybe the worst was behind them. Maybe they had already won. But illusions are fragile. Yes, Cos had surrendered. But Santa Anna still ruled Mexico. Yes, San Antonio was quiet. But the silence had a ticking heart beneath it. Yes, they had captured a city. But they had also painted a target on their backs. The Texians were proud, and tired, and a little reckless. They thought the fight was winding down, but in truth, it had just begun. Winter wore on. Fires burned low. The city grew colder in more ways than one. Some rebels went home. They thought the job was done. Others stayed, guarding their prize. They patrolled the streets, repaired walls, waited for reinforcements that might never come. The Alamo, once a mission, now a fortress, became their stronghold. They called it a position, a defense post, but really it was a waiting room for what came next, and no one could see how close the storm already was. Outside the city, messengers came and went. Reports drifted in, Mexican troops mobilizing, Santa Anna on the march, columns forming in the interior, artillery moving north. It was easy to ignore, to believe that the vast distances would slow them down, that the snows would stall them, that maybe, just maybe, Santa Anna had given up. But Santa Anna didn't give up, and he didn't forget. What happened in Gonzales had stung. What happened in San Antonio had enraged him. And when tyrants are enraged, they don't bargain. They punish. But for now, the Texians dreamed. They cleaned their muskets, told stories around campfires, imagined what a free Texas might look like. They thought they had struck the blow that would shatter the chains, and perhaps they had. But sometimes, breaking the chain only draws the jailer closer. Still, in those days of early winter, San Antonio felt like a promise that they could win, that right could triumph, that this patchwork rebellion might just become a republic. They smiled more often. They planned for spring. They whispered about elections. They didn't know they were building a monument, not to victory, but to sacrifice. The road to San Antonio had been rough, wild, and uncertain, but they had taken it. And in doing so, they had crossed a threshold they could not uncross. The fight was no longer about a single cannon or a single town. It was now about the soul of Texas. And souls, once awakened, do not sleep easily. The peace they felt was real, but it was the kind of peace that only lives in the eye of a storm.
Before the smoke, before the charge, before they became silhouettes in paintings and names on memorials, they were just people. Some barely old enough to shave, some weathered by loss, all of them far from comfort, yet somehow right at home in danger. They didn't arrive at the Alamo as martyrs. They came as volunteers, or wanderers, or survivors of something else. Let's look beyond the statues and into the stories, into the lives that stood behind that crumbling wall. William B. Travis wasn't supposed to be in charge. When William Barrett Travis arrived in Texas, he was still in his 20s, too young to carry the weight he'd end up bearing, too old to believe the world owed him anything. A failed marriage, mounting debt, and a reputation for drama had chased him out of Alabama. But on the Texan frontier, failure was just another form of rebirth. Travis was ambitious. He dressed in fine clothes when possible and insisted on decorum even in the mud. He wasn't necessarily loved. But his pen was sharper than most men's swords, and when he wrote, people listened. Even those who didn't like him knew one thing: he meant what he said. He arrived at the Alamo with a small detachment, intended to reinforce, not lead. But command is a slippery thing. When Bowie grew sick, when the leadership blurred, it was Travis who took the burden. He didn't flinch, not even when it was clear help wasn't coming, not even when the walls began to tremble. He was steady, defiant, even graceful in doom. James Bowie was already a legend before he rode through the gates. His name had floated through the South like smoke from a campfire. Land speculator, brawler. The inventor, or at least namesake, of the long, curved knife that cut both flesh and myth. Bowie wasn't born noble. He clawed his way into money, into power, into respect, though not always by clean means. And yet, beneath the stories of knife fights and drinking, there was something else. A man who had known love. A man who had buried his Mexican wife and children when the plague came. A man who, by the time he limped into the Alamo, seemed already half gone. He fell sick not long after arrival. Some say tuberculosis, others typhoid. By the time the final assault came, he could barely lift his head. But they say he died fighting, pistols in both hands on a sickbed soaked with sweat. He was brave, yes, but maybe more than that, he was tired. Still, he didn't leave, not when he had the chance. Of all the defenders, Davy Crockett brought the most fame and the least certainty. He had been a congressman, a storyteller, a hunter wrapped in coonskin and applause. But by 1836, the crowd had moved on. He had lost re-election. Tennessee no longer needed its backwoods hero. So he wandered west. Some say he came looking for a new start. Others say he came chasing the sound of drums and destiny. When he arrived in Texas, people gawked. The man from the papers was here with his rifle, his tall tales, and his wild grin. At the Alamo, he played music, fiddled under the stars. He wasn't the best shot, nor the most organized, but he was steady, unflinching, the kind of presence that made others feel less alone. We don't know exactly how he died. Some say he fell in battle, others that he was captured and executed. But maybe that's fitting. A man made half of fact, half of fiction. He left just enough mystery behind to become eternal. Not every name echoes in textbooks. But they stood too. Jose Toribio Lozoya, a Tejano from San Antonio, defending his own hometown. He'd grown up in the shadow of the Alamo walls. He knew its corners, its dust, its breath. He stayed not for some abstract idea of independence, but for his family, for his people. Juan Seguin, though not present during the final battle, helped rally Tejano support. His riders carried the fire of revolution on native soil. Not all Mexicans sided with Santa Anna. Some fought to save a land they loved from tyranny, regardless of what flag flew overhead. Joe, a formerly enslaved man, served as Travis's personal attendant. During the battle, he loaded weapons and carried messages. He survived, spared by Santa Anna, possibly because of his race or his role. Afterward, he carried word of the Alamo to Sam Houston. A survivor, a messenger, a witness history nearly forgot. William Zuber was only 15 when he volunteered. He didn't make it to the Alamo, but others his age did. There were boys inside those walls. Young, frightened, eager boys who died before ever becoming men. The gates weren't locked. And before the siege began, many had the chance to leave. Some did. But most stayed. Why? It wasn't because they thought they'd win. They didn't. It wasn't because they were saints. They weren't. They stayed because somehow, this broken old mission in a half-forgotten corner of Mexico had become a stand, a final line, a message. Even if no one answered their call, even if their names were never remembered. They stayed because to leave would have meant silence. And even doomed voices can echo. They weren't angels. They weren't statues. They weren't even all on the same page about what they were fighting for. But they were there. Together. For 13 days. Some for glory. Some for redemption. Some because there was nowhere else to go. They came from the hills of Tennessee, the plazas of San Antonio, the cotton fields of Alabama. And they ended in a chapel with crumbling walls surrounded by smoke and stone, not legends, not ghosts, just men with names and stories and reasons. And they stayed. February frost clung to stone. The stars flickered like signals. The nights were quiet, too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that soothes, the kind that waits. In the ruins of the Alamo, silence had weight. The wind threaded through shattered doors and over cold walls. Footsteps echoed louder than they should. Whispers felt like warnings. It was February in San Antonio. The sky stayed clear, like glass stretched tight over the earth. The frost came early, dusting rooftops with a pale glaze. Each breath hung in the air like a ghost reluctant to leave. And then, the boots came. They didn't hear him first. They saw the dust, a long smear on the horizon. Not clouds, not fog, but men, a crimson wave swelling from the south. Banners, brass, and boots. So many boots. Santa Anna had arrived. Not just a general, not just a president. He came cloaked in absolute power, wrapped in self-belief, and mounted on revenge. He had marched his army across frozen rivers and through desert cold that killed horses in their tracks. He lost men by the dozens, even hundreds, but still they came. Starving, shivering, bleeding, and yet marching. The Texians had not expected him so soon. They believed winter would slow him. They thought they'd have more time. They were wrong. By mid-February, his army camped in the shadow of San Antonio. They set up cannon on the hill. They raised their flags. And they waited. Inside the Alamo, the defenders watched. Their enemy had arrived. And he wasn't bluffing. No trumpet blast, no first cannonball, just the slow tightening of a noose. On February 23rd, the siege began, not with thunder, but with silence. The Mexican forces moved in quietly, blocking all exits from the town. The Alamo was surrounded. 1 minute San Antonio had felt sleepy. The next, it was a trap. From the towers of the mission, men peered out, counting tents. They stopped counting after a while. There were too many. Santa Anna didn't attack immediately. He didn't have to. He had numbers, he had time. The defenders had neither. 13 days. That's how long the Alamo held. But it wasn't just the walls holding back an army. It was fear, it was desperation. It was the refusal to collapse under the weight of inevitability. Each morning began with cannon fire. Mexican artillery cracked the dawn like an alarm. The defenders scrambled, patched walls, ducked from debris, braced themselves. Then came the waiting. Each evening ended in stillness so loud it almost screamed. They ran low on food, on powder, on certainty. The ground outside was littered with spent shells and the frozen breath of soldiers who dared not sleep. Inside, men grew restless. They sharpened knives out of habit. They cleaned guns that had no bullets left to fire. They counted days. Some counted prayers. At first, there was talk of strategy, of hope, of reinforcements that would surely come. But by the 5th day, the voices got quieter. By the 7th, they started looking at the sky more than each other. By the 9th, no one said when help comes. They said if. Space inside the Alamo was cramped and cold. There were no bunks, just hard ground, scattered hay and stone. Men slept in shifts. A few dreamed of home. Most didn't sleep at all. The leaders did what they could. Travis, still writing, still commanding. Bowie, half-conscious from his cot. Crockett, fiddling quietly when no one was looking, more for himself than anyone else. But even leadership couldn't stop the cracks. Some men spoke of escape. A few tried to slip out. Most were caught or came back. Where would they even go? Outside, the Mexican drums beat slow, methodical. A reminder, the enemy was patient. Time was on his side. Inside the walls, every conversation ended the same way. We can't hold forever. And yet, they stayed. When the cannonballs stopped, when the wind fell quiet, the pens came out. Words, they were the only thing that could leave. Across a candlelit table, Travis wrote letter after letter, not for politics, not for glory, but because hope, no matter how faint, needed somewhere to go. Others wrote too, to wives, to brothers, to friends who might still be days away. Some wrote down their names in ledgers, not because they expected rescue, but because they wanted to be remembered. They buried letters in the earth. They handed them to riders who slipped out through enemy lines under moonlight. Most of those riders never made it far, but a few did, and word began to spread. The Alamo was under siege. Some volunteers gathered their rifles and set off. Others hesitated. It was far, dangerous, and possibly too late. Back inside the mission, the men could only wait. And so the days bled together. Cannon smoke at dawn, prayers at dusk, drums that never stopped beating. Even when food ran low, even when spirits dipped, there was still one thing left: conviction. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. Not yet. They were too cold for that, too tired, too human. They were just men in a trap, but they chose to remain in it. On the 12th night, the stars looked closer, as if the sky was leaning in. There were no dreams that night, no jokes, no songs, just silence. A silence deeper than death. The kind that knows what's coming. Some scribbled last words. Some found a quiet corner to sit alone. Some stared at the stone and tried not to cry. They all heard it. The movement in the dark. The rustle of finality. The calm before the roar. He wrote by firelight, the cold gnawing at his fingers. The night was heavy, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes you feel smaller than you already are. But he still wrote, because he had to, because words were the only thing that could still escape. Outside, the Mexican drums kept their slow rhythm, like a clock ticking towards something no one wanted to name. Inside the crumbling walls of the Alamo, paper became the last remaining weapon. And William Barrett Travis, barely older than a boy, turned to it with the weight of command pulling at his shoulders. He didn't write for show, not anymore, not with the cannonballs already cracking the sky. He wrote because he knew the end could be hours, maybe days away. He wrote because if no one came, they'd vanish, all of them, and no one would even know why. There was no time to soften things, no space for polite phrasing or false hope, just a truth hammered out in ink, raw, defiant, desperate. He signed his name, lit a candle stub, and handed it off to a courier who didn't need to be told what it meant. The writer knew, everyone knew, this was a letter from the edge. Others followed. The same message dressed in different fears. They were addressed to anyone who would listen. Sam Houston, nearby militias, friends, strangers, God. Help was needed, not later, not soon, now. And still, no one came. Not fast enough, anyway. Every time a letter left the Alamo, it had to cross a ring of steel and silence. Mexican soldiers manned posts all around the town. They lit fires to watch the walls. They kept their rifles close. And in the space between, the couriers tried to slip through. These weren't hardened warriors. They were blacksmiths, farmers, teenagers. A few were Tejanos who believed in something bigger than one side or the other. Most carried only a rifle, a note, and whatever luck was left. Some crawled through brush, their breath held tight against their teeth. Others galloped under moonlight, ducking low as bullets hissed through the dark. A few never made it past the river. The enemy was everywhere. But some of them did get out. They reached distant camps, taverns, homesteads, wherever help might live. They dropped the letters like stones into still water, hoping the ripples would spread. The responses came slow. Some men grabbed their rifles and rode without thinking. Others hesitated. They had families. They had doubts. And there were rumors, too, about how many surrounded the Alamo, how hopeless it might be. Still, the letters kept arriving. Each one echoed with the same beat, not just a request, but a dare. Come and fight. Come and die if need be, but come. Those who read them didn't forget. Even those who stayed behind felt something change, because those words, scratched out in candlelight, carried across enemy lines, weren't just cries for help. They were a mirror. They showed the truth of what was happening inside those walls, and they made silence feel like betrayal. Travis wasn't the only one writing. Others followed his lead. Crockett, Bowie's men, volunteers from Georgia, Tennessee, New Orleans. They all found scraps of paper and filled them with fragments of their soul. No eloquence, no grand speeches, just the need to be heard before the final shot rang out. Some sent letters to loved ones, others to commanders who might be near enough to reach them. A few just scribbled their names over and over, like they were afraid they'd be erased. And maybe they were right. But in those letters lived a kind of defiance, a belief that words, however fragile, could hold off the end for one more day, that maybe, just maybe, someone would answer. Reinforcements did come, eventually. A trickle, a dozen here, a handful there. Some got through. Some were cut down trying, and some arrived only in time to watch the sky change color and realize they were too late. The men inside didn't know who would come or when, but every sound beyond the walls made them hope. Every hoofbeat in the distance pulled their eyes toward the horizon. Every unopened gate was a question, and still the letters went out. Even when they knew the odds, even when rations ran low and spirits sank into their boots, they wrote not because they believed in miracles, but because they believed in being remembered. Each courier became more than a messenger. They became the thread connecting the doom to the world outside. Without them, the story would have ended quietly, swallowed by stone and smoke. Instead, it was carried by horse, by hand, by memory, passed from campfire to capital, and eventually those words would fuel something far bigger than a lost cause. But inside the Alamo, it didn't feel noble, it didn't feel historic. It just felt cold and quiet and waiting. What the letters meant, well, that depended on where you were standing. To the defenders, they were lifelines. To those who received them, they were riddles soaked in urgency. To Santa Ana, they were irrelevant. The cannonballs still came, the drums still marched, the sky still stayed empty. And yet, the letters mattered. Not because they brought salvation, but because they told the truth. This wasn't about tactics or land or glory. This was about a few dozen men, trapped inside walls too old to defend, telling the world they existed, that they resisted, that they refused to vanish without a sound. Even when no rescue arrived, even when the gate stayed closed, even when the silence answered louder than any gunshot, they wrote, because that's what people do when faced with the end. They reach out, not to stop it, but to be seen. The letters didn't change the outcome. The Alamo still fell. The defenders still died. The cannons still roared and the flag still dropped. But the words didn't vanish. They lingered. In pockets. In memory. in stories told around firelight long after the smoke cleared. And maybe that was enough to be remembered, to be read, to echo even faintly in the minds of those who would come next. They weren't just writing for rescue. They were writing to say, we were here. And sometimes, that's the only victory you get.
It began in the dark, the kind of dark that makes the world feel like it's holding its breath. Cold air clung to the stones of the Alamo, thick with the kind of stillness that only comes before something terrible. Inside the walls, men stirred from uneasy sleep or didn't sleep at all. They'd heard the drum start before dawn, a low, steady beat. And then came the bugles, a sharp sound that tore through the quiet, like a blade. They knew what was coming. For 13 days the siege had worn them down. The defenders had waited behind crumbling walls, watching the enemy grow bolder, closer, more confident. Santa Anna had waited long enough. March 6th was the day the waiting ended. The Mexican army moved in waves, not a mad rush, but a precision strike. Soldiers climbed over ladders, broke through outer defenses, flooded through breaches that had taken days of cannon fire to create. The first wave was meant to overwhelm the outer perimeter. They met with musket fire, sharp and desperate. The defenders had few rifles, little powder, but they fought like men with nothing left to lose. By the second wave, the defenders were falling back, drawn into tighter corners of the mission. The chapel, the barracks, the courtyard, each room turned into a battlefield. Smoke thickened, gunshots echoed like thunder trapped in stone. It wasn't war in the traditional sense anymore. It was survival, personal, immediate. One man against another, bayonets, rifle butts, blades. Some defenders were shot from rooftops or cut down as they tried to reload. Others grabbed whatever they could find, swords, broken muskets, even stones. When the third wave surged in, it wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about endurance. How long a man could hold a hallway, how far he could run before another door was broken open. Inside the low stone walls, the battle turned to chaos. Fires broke out. Black powder exploded in tight quarters. Screams rang out in Spanish and English, mixing with the clash of metal and the pounding of boots on flagstones. The Alamo, never built for war, collapsed under the pressure of it. In the sick room, James Bowie lay too weak to stand. Ill for days, possibly near death even before the final attack, he likely never left his bed. Some said he fired pistols from under his blanket. Others claimed he was bayoneted in place, too weak to resist. There were no witnesses who lived to confirm the truth. But what's known is simple. He died surrounded, unable to run, but never yielding. Elsewhere, David Crockett was fighting to the end, or at least fighting until he couldn't anymore. The stories about him vary. Some say he died with his back to a wall, surrounded by bodies. Others say he was captured alive and executed after the final shot. There's no way to know for sure, but whichever version is true, it ended the same way. Crockett, already a legend in his lifetime, became a ghost on that day. Another body left among the rubble. William Travis had likely died early in the assault. A single shot, maybe a saber blow. He'd stood on the north wall trying to rally his men, and then he was gone. Leadership didn't matter once the walls were overrun. Every man had to fight alone. By the time the fourth and final wave of Mexican soldiers entered the mission, the battle was more like a hunt. Pockets of defenders had holed up in rooms behind overturned furniture, inside corners of the chapel. They knew there was no escape. Some tried anyway, cutting through back walls, jumping from second stories, charging into the open in a last act of defiance. They were gunned down, cut off, surrounded. Inside the chapel, the last stronghold, the final resistance ended. Mexican troops poured in from the front. The defenders were cornered. Some died fighting. Some may have tried to surrender. Some simply ran out of ammunition. In the end, blood pooled across the stone floor. The cross-shaped room that once echoed with prayer now echoed with pain. Smoke clung to the ceiling. The last shots rang out like punctuation marks to a sentence that had already been written. One by one, the voices inside the Alamo went silent. It didn't take long. The entire assault lasted less than 90 minutes. For all the days of waiting, the end came fast. The defenders, numbering less than 200, were killed almost to a man. A few non-combatants were spared, women, children, a handful of enslaved people. They watched it happen, heard it all, saw the dust rise as the walls shook from the final blows. Santa Anna's men moved through the ruins, making sure nothing was left standing. Any surviving defenders were cut down where they stood. The battle had turned into a message: no quarter, no survivors. This wasn't just about reclaiming a mission. It was about crushing a rebellion before it could spread. And in that sense, March 6th was a success for the Mexican army. But victory came at a cost. The Mexican troops lost hundreds of men in the attack. The resistance had been stronger, fiercer than expected, and the message they sent, a message written in blood and fire, didn't have the effect they hoped. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the calm that comes before retaliation. News of the Alamo's fall traveled fast, and the stories that came with it, true or not, sparked a fire across Texas. But that would come later. On that morning, inside the walls, it was just ruin. Bodies lay across the courtyard, slumped over cannons, sprawled in doorways. The air stank of smoke, iron, and the sharp edge of death. The sun rose over a place that looked nothing like it had the day before. The Alamo was broken, burned, spent. There was no music left, no drums, no bugles, only wind and the quiet shuffle of boots through ash. It was over. The mission that had once served as a church, then a fort, then a final refuge, had become a grave. The defenders had given everything, not for glory. Most had no idea they'd be remembered, but because they were there, because they believed they were part of something, or because there was nowhere else to go. It wasn't a clean end. It wasn't noble or cinematic. It was brutal, dirty, human. Men who'd written letters, made promises, kissed families goodbye. They were gone now, reduced to numbers in reports and ashes on stone. But something of them stayed. Not in the weapons or the walls, or even the bodies, but in the decision to stand when running was easier, to fight when surrender would have meant survival, to believe, even in the face of death, that their story would matter. The final day wasn't a moment of triumph. It wasn't a last stand carved out of legend. It was a collapse, the final crack in a wall already riddled with holes. And still they stood, until they couldn't. The guns fell silent, but the air didn't clear. Smoke hung heavy over the Alamo like a fog that refused to lift. Rubble lined the courtyards. The walls, already cracked and battered from days of cannon fire, now stood jagged and hollow. Inside, bodies lay scattered in twisted shapes, broken not just by bullets or blades, but by the sheer weight of what they had tried to do. There were no cheers of victory, no triumphant music or rallying cries. Just the soft tread of boots on scorched stone, the quiet groans of the dying, and the occasional distant order barked by a Mexican officer trying to restore discipline in the wake of the chaos. It wasn't a celebration. It was cleanup. Santa Anna made his intentions clear. The fallen defenders of the Alamo were not to be honored with burial. There would be no graves, no markers, no time for mourning. Their bodies were dragged, lifted, or shoved into piles. Some were burned where they had fallen. Others were carried just outside the mission walls, dumped into pyres built from shattered doors and broken wagons. Flames did the work that memory refused to. The ash that rose into the air didn't just mark the end of a battle. It tried to erase it, burn away the defiance, hide the resistance, turn martyrs into smoke. Among the ruins, a few survived. Susanna Dickinson clutched her young daughter, both covered in dust, blood, and the heavy silence of trauma. They had been inside during the final moments, witnesses to the chaos but spared from the slaughter. Alongside them were a handful of others, women, children, and one or two enslaved individuals. They were pulled from the wreckage, not as guests, but as messages. Santa Anna knew what he was doing. He didn't just let them live. He made them carry the story forward. Susanna Dickinson was given strict instructions. She would go to the provisional Texan government and tell them what had happened. Every brutal detail, every corpse, every flame. It wasn't kindness, it was theater, a warning dressed as mercy. Other survivors were not so lucky. Some defenders had surrendered, maybe wounded, maybe disarmed, maybe just too late to keep fighting. They were rounded up in the aftermath, treated not as prisoners of war but as rebels. And rebels, Santa Anna had declared, would not be given quarter. A few were executed on the spot. Others were held briefly, only to be led outside and shot. Their names, in many cases, were never recorded. Their stories ended with the sound of gunfire echoing across the fields just beyond the Alamo's walls. What was left of the mission became something else entirely. Not a fort, not a church, not even a ruin. It became a symbol, though not immediately. In those first few days, it was just a scar on the land. The charred smell lingered. The courtyard was soaked through with blood that dried into the cracks. Birds didn't even circle above it. They had already fed. But while the silence lingered in San Antonio, the news did not. Word of what had happened traveled fast. Couriers, some who had fled before the final assault, some who had snuck away in the early hours, spread the word across Texas. Each version of the story came with new horrors, some exaggerated, some underplayed. But the ending was always the same. The Alamo had fallen, and no one had come to save it. For many in Texas, that was a gut punch. The idea that their heroes had called for help and received nothing, that they had stood their ground and died for it. The psychological wound was deep. People who had cheered the idea of resistance began to question whether it was worth it. Others doubled down, enraged by the thought that Santa Anna had not only crushed the Alamo, but humiliated it. The executions didn't help. News of surrendered prisoners being shot spread quickly, sparking outrage. It painted Santa Anna not as a disciplined general, but as a butcher. The burning of the bodies was salt in the wound. It felt like more than punishment. It felt like desecration. To many Texans, it confirmed their worst fears. This wasn't just a war over land or politics. It was a war for survival. Across Texas, people reacted differently. Some packed up and left. Whole towns emptied as settlers fled east, fearing that Santa Anna's army would continue its march. It was the beginning of what became known as the Runaway Scrape, an exodus of families who didn't wait to see if the Alamo would be repeated elsewhere. They had seen enough, or heard enough. Either way, they weren't staying to find out. Others picked up rifles and joined militias. Anger turned into determination. The memory of the Alamo, still raw and fresh, gave many of them purpose. They didn't know all the facts. Most had no idea what the defenders had really faced or how outnumbered they'd been. But that didn't matter. The story had taken root. The idea of it. That small group of men had stood their ground, and now it was someone else's turn. Inside San Antonio, Mexican troops remained stationed. They repaired parts of the mission, set up their own defenses, and maintained order. But even they could feel it. The sense that what had happened at the Alamo hadn't just killed men. It had changed something. The building no longer felt like a stronghold. It felt like a warning. For Santa Anna, the victory was part of a larger plan. He believed that crushing the Alamo would send a message so loud, so terrifying, that no other Texan forces would stand against him. But if anything, it did the opposite. Instead of stopping the rebellion, it gave it fuel. The psychological aftermath wasn't fear, it was fury. In homes and taverns and military camps across the territory, people whispered the names of the fallen. They didn't know who exactly had died, not all of them. But the names that did emerge, Crockett, Bowie, Travis, they weren't just men anymore. They were symbols of defiance, of sacrifice. The messy truth of their final moments didn't matter. The myth had already started to grow. Meanwhile, Susanna Dickinson and others like her carried the burden of memory, not just the facts, but the feeling of it. What it was like to sit in that mission day after day knowing help might never come, what it was like to hear the walls fall, to see the flames, to walk out of the ruins while others stayed behind silent forever. She didn't ask for that role, but it followed her for the rest of her life. The Alamo itself would not be rebuilt right away. It stood half-ruined, charred in places, its chapel still intact but hollowed out. No one rushed to restore it. It was not a place people wanted to return to, not yet. The land around it grew quiet again, but it wasn't peace. It was the uneasy calm of a place that had seen too much. But Texas was not quiet. Across the region, the aftermath of the Alamo settled into people's bones. The fear, the rage, the guilt, it all simmered together. Some blamed the Texan government for failing to send reinforcements. Others blamed Santa Anna for his brutality. Some simply mourned. But all of it added up to one thing. The war wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. It didn't happen all at once, but from the ashes of the Alamo, something began to stir. A slow, seething resolve spread across Texas. Men who had never touched a musket now trained in fields. Families who had once debated independence quietly packed supplies and chose a side. The defeat in San Antonio didn't crush the Texan spirit, it electrified it. Word spread faster than fire. Couriers rode east, telling the tale in every town they passed about the hopeless stand, the outnumbered men, the brutal end. The specifics shifted with each retelling, but the feeling was always the same. Something terrible had happened, and something had to be done about it. Across the United States, the news took on a life of its own. Newspapers carried headlines of the slaughter at the Alamo. Some framed it as a tragedy, others as a call to arms. For many Americans, it was the first time they had heard of a small mission in Texas, but now they couldn't forget it. The names of the fallen, especially Crockett, a man who had already been mythologized back east, turned into rallying symbols. People who had never set foot in Texas began raising money, gathering supplies, and even heading south to fight. Texas suddenly wasn't just a far-off skirmish. It was a frontier battleground between freedom and tyranny, at least in the eyes of those watching from afar. The Alamo became shorthand for bravery, sacrifice, and the high cost of resistance. It didn't matter that it ended in defeat. That's what gave it power. It was a story of men who stayed behind when they could have run, a story that burned into the American imagination. Meanwhile, back in Texas, the war wasn't waiting for emotions to settle. Sam Houston, now commanding the Texan Army, knew he had limited time. His troops were outnumbered, poorly trained, and constantly on the move. The memory of the Alamo weighed heavily on them. It wasn't just a battle lost, it was a looming threat. They knew what Santa Anna was capable of. They had seen the smoking remains. But fear didn't break them, it sharpened them. Throughout March and into April, Houston led a strategic retreat, buying time, avoiding direct confrontation, waiting for the right moment to strike. His men grumbled, some questioned the plan, but they followed. Each mile put them farther from defeat and closer to a chance at redemption. That chance came at San Jacinto. It was supposed to be just another day. The Mexican army, confident after victories at the Alamo and Goliad, had grown complacent. Camped near the San Jacinto River, they believed the Texan army was too weak, too scared, or too far away to be a real threat. They set up camp, took off their boots, and waited. Houston didn't wait. On April 21st, 1836, the Texan army launched a surprise attack in the middle of the afternoon. The assault was fast, chaotic, and overwhelming. Mexican soldiers, caught off guard, tried to form ranks but were cut down. Some fled into the river, others were chased through the marshes. It was over in just 18 minutes, not hours, not days, minutes. What had begun at the Alamo ended in a furious crescendo at San Jacinto. The phrase carried on the battlefield wasn't just a chant, it was a roar that echoed with every musket shot, every saber thrust. It was the emotional release of men who had held on to grief and rage since March. It wasn't just a military assault, it was vengeance, justice, fury, and desperation rolled into one. In the chaos, Santa Anna vanished. He had swapped uniforms with a regular soldier and tried to escape, but was captured the next day, hiding in tall grass, hoping to blend in. When brought before Houston, his presence was met with shock and disbelief. The very man who had ordered the destruction of the Alamo was now a prisoner. The tide had not just turned, it had crashed down. The days that followed were strange. The war had seemingly ended, but not in a way anyone had expected. Santa Anna, once the fearsome ruler of Mexico, was now being held in a Texan camp, treated with a cautious mix of civility and suspicion. Houston, wounded during the battle, had to decide what to do with a man whose very name sparked rage in every Texan heart. Killing him would be easy. Letting him live would be harder, but more useful. From his position as prisoner, Santa Anna signed agreements recognizing the independence of Texas, under duress, of course, but for the moment, it was enough. The army withdrew, the killing stopped, and for the first time since the revolution began, Texas was no longer at war. But it wasn't at peace either. Winning independence didn't magically solve everything. The new Republic of Texas had a name, but little else. Its government was young, its currency unstable, its borders contested. The Mexican government didn't recognize the agreements Santa Anna had signed, claiming they were made under coercion, and Santa Anna, once returned to Mexico, would later disavow the whole thing. Still, the victory at San Jacinto changed the world for those who had fought for it. Texas wasn't a dream anymore. It was real. A nation born not in a hall of diplomats, but on battlefields soaked in blood. The men who had died at the Alamo didn't live to see it, but they had shaped it. Their loss had set the tempo for everything that followed. Their deaths gave others a reason to live and to fight. In the months that followed, the survivors tried to rebuild. Towns gutted by war reopened their shops. Families who had fled during the runaway scrape trickled back home, carrying what little they had left. New settlers came, drawn by the stories of resistance and opportunity. Flags were raised, constitutions drafted, leaders elected, and across the land people began speaking of Texas not just as a place, but as an idea. An idea that freedom was worth dying for, that bravery didn't need to win to matter, that sometimes the most important stand is the one that ends in silence. The Alamo, once a forgotten mission, now stood as a sacred ruin. People visited it not to admire the architecture, but to walk where heroes had fallen. They traced the broken walls, stood in the shadow of the chapel, and listened for echoes. And whether they believed the legends or not, everyone felt the weight of what had happened there. It hadn't won the war, but it had done something more lasting. It had made sure the war meant something. And in doing so, it helped shape the birth of a nation, not with votes or signatures, but with fire. It didn't take long. Even as the ruins of the Alamo still smoldered, stories were already beginning to grow out of its ashes. Bigger than the battle, bolder than the truth. What had happened in San Antonio was already powerful, but what followed would turn it into something sacred, something untouchable, something almost unreal. And at the heart of that transformation stood one man, Davy Crockett. In life, he was a frontier politician, a former congressman with a knack for spinning tall tales and a hunger for the next big thing. But in death, especially a death wrapped in such drama, he became something more. The man who'd once roamed the forests of Tennessee became, almost overnight, a symbol of raw American courage. It didn't really matter how he died. Whether fighting to the last breath or surrendering and being executed, the specifics blurred. The point was that he was there, that he stood with the defenders, that he stayed when he could have fled. The messier truth was swept away in favor of a cleaner, sharper image. Crockett the fearless, Crockett the patriot, Crockett the last man standing. His legend traveled fast and traveled far. Ballads were written, books printed, plays staged. Kids in New York and Philadelphia suddenly knew the name of a man who died in Texas. He was painted with a coonskin cap and a long rifle, standing tall against impossible odds. He became the face of the Alamo's legacy, even if others had fought just as bravely or more. But Crockett wasn't the only one being elevated. The Alamo itself was transforming. Once just a battered Spanish mission, it was now hallowed ground. The broken walls weren't ruins anymore. They were relics. The chapel became a shrine, not just to the fallen, but to the idea they came to represent. People walked its grounds not as tourists, but as pilgrims. Over time, that reverence only deepened. The story of the Alamo began showing up in speeches and sermons, in schoolbooks and parades. It was more than history, it was identity. For Texans, it represented defiance, pride, and the willingness to stand for something even when you knew you'd lose. For Americans, it embodied the spirit of the frontier, the mythic idea that one person with courage was worth more than 1,000 without it. But myths don't stay simple for long. As decades passed, the story was stretched and reshaped to serve the needs of whoever was telling it. Politicians used it to justify expansion. Artists turned it into theater. Filmmakers, especially in the golden age of Hollywood, took the tale and added their own touch. Swelling music, glorious last stands, heroic deaths in slow motion. The details were polished, edited, dramatized, and always the line between truth and fiction got blurrier. In black and white films, Crockett swung his rifle like a warhammer and never missed a shot. Bowie died mid-fight, surrounded by dozens, his knife flashing in every direction. Travis stood atop a cannon, shouting into the smoke, fearless and alone. These weren't just men anymore, they were icons, larger than life, perfectly drawn, and untouchable. But in crafting these heroes, the rest of the story got quieter. The Tejanos, who had fought alongside the defenders, often ignored or written out entirely, the complicated politics that led to the revolution, glossed over. The moral contradictions of the rebellion, including slavery and land disputes, tucked into the margins or erased completely. The myth needed heroes, not questions, so it smoothed out the rough edges. That's what myths do. They aren't about accuracy, they're about meaning. And the Alamo's meaning only grew as the years rolled on. In times of war, it was invoked as an example of sacrifice. In times of peace, as a reminder of grit. It was cited by generals, printed on posters, etched into coins. People who had never read a page of Texas history could still shout its name and feel something stir. But the deeper the legend settled, the more tightly it held on to its version of the truth. By the 20th century, challenges to the myth began to surface. Historians started asking harder questions about how many defenders really died, about whether Crockett surrendered, about what the rebellion meant to Mexico, and how it fit into the broader patterns of conquest and colonization. These weren't popular questions, but they mattered. Because behind every myth is a choice, to remember or to glorify, to ask or to assume. The Alamo, for all its power, sits on that line, a real place with real blood in the dirt, but also a stage where America projected what it wanted to see. And what it wanted was clear: a story of bravery, sacrifice, and resistance against tyranny, a clean moral arc, simple and stirring. But the real story isn't simple. It's a story of fear and ambition, of land and politics, of tragedy and inspiration. It's about men who fought because they believed they had to, even when it meant dying. It's about loss, and about the stories we choose to tell ourselves so the loss doesn't feel meaningless. Crockett probably wasn't the last man standing. Travis wasn't perfect. Bowie may not have even been conscious when the final assault came, but together their deaths and the way they were remembered formed a kind of national mirror, People saw what they wanted to see: courage, defiance, identity, and in doing so, the myth became real. Not because it was accurate then, but because it was needed. And in the end, that's what keeps it alive. Not the facts, but the feeling. A feeling passed down through generations, etched into stone, taught in classrooms, performed on stages. A feeling that says, stand your ground, hold the line, even when you know the outcome. That feeling, that fire, is the real legacy of the Alamo, and it still burns.
The cannons are gone now. The smoke has long since faded. What's left of the Alamo stands in silence. Stone walls worn thin by time and footsteps, shadows cast by the midday sun, and the quiet murmur of tourists trying to imagine a battle they can no longer see. It's hard to picture fire and fury here. The chapel sits still, surrounded by manicured gardens and historical markers. The space feels more like a museum than a battlefield, and yet for many, it remains one of the most emotionally charged pieces of ground in the country. But what you see at the Alamo today isn't exactly what stood there in 1836. The walls, though old, have been rebuilt and reshaped. The iconic facade of the chapel, the one burned into every textbook and postcard, was never part of the original church. That hump in the roof, a later addition. The courtyard, reorganized. The long barracks, restored and repurposed. Some parts are original, some are replicas, some are guesswork. The past here is part archaeology, part stagecraft. Preserving the site has never been simple. It's a patchwork of public, private, and nonprofit ownership. Debates have raged for years over how to present it, how much to reconstruct, how much to modernize. Should it be sacred space, tourist attraction, classroom, memorial, theme park? Everyone has an opinion. And because the Alamo means so many different things to so many people, consensus is rare. Efforts to restore the Alamo to its 1836 state have run into all kinds of trouble. Historians argue over where walls actually stood. Activists push to include the stories of Tejanos and native peoples who lived and died in the area. Preservationists warn that digging too much could destroy what little remains. And yet the push continues to peel back the layers of modern construction and reveal something closer to what once was. But even if you could rebuild every brick exactly as it stood, the real challenge isn't the architecture, it's the memory. In Texas, the Alamo is remembered as a symbol of independence. It's taught early, repeated often, and celebrated as the beginning of something powerful. Children recite the names of Travis, Crockett, and Bowie as if they were saints. School field trips bring young students to walk the grounds and feel the weight of history. And every year, reenactors in costume play out the 13-day siege like a sacred ritual. But across the border, the memory shifts. In Mexico, the Alamo is a footnote, not a shrine. The story isn't one of noble resistance. It's about rebels rising against lawful authority. The Mexican army didn't see itself as an invader. It saw itself as enforcing the law, defending the republic, and quelling an uprising. The soldiers who stormed the mission weren't monsters. They were following orders, fighting for a government that, at the time, still claimed Texas as its own. This divide in memory creates tension. One side sees heroes, the other sees traitors. One side mourns a loss, the other barely marks it. And in that gap lies the deeper question: whose version of the past do we protect? The Alamo has always been a story shaped by the storyteller. In Texas, the version that dominated for decades was the mythic one. Brave Anglo defenders holding the line against a faceless Mexican army. But that's only part of the truth. There were Tejanos inside the Alamo. There were disagreements among the defenders. There were deeper reasons behind the conflict. Economic, political, cultural, that rarely made it into school books. Over the last few decades, more voices have stepped forward to fill in the missing pieces. Scholars have highlighted the role of slavery in Texas's rebellion. Community leaders have called for greater recognition of indigenous and Mexican contributions to the region's history. And descendants of those who fought on both sides have asked for a more complete picture, one that doesn't sacrifice accuracy for drama. But that push for nuance often meets resistance. For many Texans, the Alamo isn't just a historic site, it's a symbol of identity. To complicate the narrative feels like a betrayal. To question the story feels like dishonor. And yet, the story has already changed many times over. The image of Crockett swinging his rifle atop a pile of bodies wasn't recorded by witnesses. It was drawn by artists. The line in the sand? Retold, not documented. Much of what people believe about the Alamo comes not from history, but from memory. And memory is tricky. It clings to what's useful. It reshapes what's uncomfortable. It doesn't care about footnotes or archives. It cares about feeling, pride, pain, legacy. So the Alamo today is more than a battlefield. It's a battleground of memory. Walk its grounds and you'll hear tour guides telling different versions of the same story. Some stick to the legend. Others explore the complexity. Some visitors nod in reverence, others ask hard questions. Everyone sees something a little different in the same worn stones. Outside the gates, San Antonio has grown tall and fast. Hotels and traffic circle the plaza. Food carts and gift shops line the sidewalks. The sacred and the ordinary brush shoulders every day. Some argue that the Alamo has become a caricature of itself, more souvenir stand than solemn memorial. Others believe that it still matters even now, precisely because it sparks so much feeling. It stands not as proof of what happened, but as a reminder that something happened, something fierce, something tragic, something transformative. And even if the story isn't told perfectly, the silence between the stones still speaks. It says, remember, but remember carefully. The Alamo still stands, but not always for the reasons we think. It's more than stone and soil. It's a story, held together by memory, belief, and the quiet space between legend and truth. And maybe that's why it endures. Not because it was the biggest battle or the most important strategically, but because it became something else. A mirror. A dream. A question we keep asking. What does it mean to resist when the outcome is certain? What does it mean to sacrifice everything, knowing the world might not remember your name, only your silhouette? The men who stayed inside the Alamo weren't perfect. Some fought for land, for pride, for causes that history would come to question. But in that final moment, when they stayed behind, when they made their stand, there was something undeniable. They chose not victory, but defiance. Not survival, but meaning. That kind of resistance leaves a mark, even if it doesn't change the outcome. The Alamo didn't win the war. It didn't save the Republic in that moment. But it gave the idea of Texas a symbol to rally around. A moment that felt bigger than tactics and generals. A moment that said, we mattered because we refused to surrender. And so the story grew, reshaped over the years to suit new needs. It became myth. It became Hollywood. It became a way to teach courage, even if the facts were softened along the way. That's the trade-off of legend. Clarity for impact. Simplicity for memory. But beneath the noise, there's still the quiet truth. The part that matters in the dark when the world is tired and someone wants to hear a story to fall asleep. That story isn't just about walls and cannons. It's about being human in a moment that demands more than fear, about standing still when everything in you says run, about hoping that even in death, something of you remains. Maybe that's why we tell this story softly, not to glorify war, not to make heroes out of men who bled like anyone else, but to sit with the weight of what they chose, and to wonder what we would have done. We tell it to remember that resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stands its ground. Sometimes it lies still in a chapel, with no one left to speak for it. And we tell it not to forget, but to gently remember. The kind of remembering that doesn't demand flags or fireworks, just a moment of stillness, a breath, a quiet truth in the back of the mind. that even the lost, the doomed, the defeated can echo forever if we let them. So as sleep draws close and the night folds in, the Alamo stands not as a warning or a command, but as a whisper, a reminder that stories survive us, that even ashes can burn bright in memory, and that sometimes in the stillness of a forgotten mission we find the courage to keep dreaming.